Dr. Bhaskar, Assistant Professor, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Anna University, Chennai. Area of specialization is software engineering and database system. Guided more than 12 research scholars, published more than 40 national and international papers. Is a reviewer and editorial board member in international journals.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in computer science. In this series of lectures, we have been looking at software engineering as a subject. Today's session, we will be discussing on software documentation. I have stressed on the importance of documentation in the beginning of the sessions. Whenever I wish to proceed with the software, either in terms of correction or in terms of development, I might require a documentation to carry forward. So, this documentation is very important during the entire phase of development and for the phase of maintenance also. Some of the major requirements of documentation include general requirements of all software documentation basically should provide communication among team members. I should basically understand what are the development methodologies, what model to be followed, what are the requirements posted by the end users, how it is to be actually converted into a spec. SRS is being produced as a document for it to get designed, and design specification is being developed for it to get developed. Likewise, every phase in the software development life cycle requires a phase of documentation. So, this documentation requirements should provide a communication among all the team members, and this should act as an information repository to be used by the maintenance engineers. Not only during the phase of development, it also exists during the phase of maintenance also. Say for example, the people who are about to use a software need to understand how it is to get used, and the people who are about to correct on the software, say an administrator, need to have a documentation to maintain it, and it should provide enough information to the management to allow them to perform all program management related activities, should describe to the users on how to operate and administer the system. So, I have said two different people who exist, one as the users, the other one as the administrator. Say for example, when we buy a product also, there are user manuals which describes about the product which has been given to the end user. In case of some problematic situations, there will be an administrator who will take the entire responsibility of how to work on the system and how to correct the system. In all software projects, some amount of documentation should be created prior to any code being written. So, before I do the coding, there should be a document which carries all the requirement specification, and there is also a document which mentions all the design specifications. So, there is a design document, there is a requirement spec document and other things. Documentation should continue after the code has been completed. So, it is not just the document which is available at the requirement spec and the design spec alone, and this document is getting continued in the next phase of development, which is the coding phase. This exists as user manual. So, there are two main types of documentation created, one as a product and as a process documents. When we look at the product documentation, this product documentation describes the delivered product and must evolve with the development of software product with two main categories: system documentation and user documentation. When I wish to understand about system documentation, this system documentation describes how the system works, but not how to operate it. Maybe that is how we would have proceeded in the early phases of software development life cycle. As a part of system documentation, we should be clear enough in mentioning what this product is about to provide you as a features, instead of mentioning how to operate on it. So, the logics behind how it got developed is not being introduced there, but then what is expected out of the system is all mentioned here. So, some of the examples of this kind of system documentation include requirement specification, architectural design and a detailed design, which does not provide information about the lower level of the system. And the same product documentation carries commented source code including the output, such as say for example the Java documentation, a detailed test plan including all the test cases, a V&V plan which mentions you about verification and validation plan and results. I again put a note where I say that how do we differentiate between verification and validation. A verification is something that, say for example a system or a component that is getting developed, before I start with a system or a component, I have a major set of objective. Say to a specific module, if I start developing that particular module with a basic set of objectives, are the objectives to that particular phase alone got resolved, then it becomes a verification. We put a word called are we building the product right becomes verification, whereas are we building the right product becomes validation. It is just a reverse of these two words, product right and right product. When it becomes product right, then it becomes verification. When it becomes right product, it becomes validation. So, the V&V, verification and validation plan and results are get to known. List of known bugs, bugs are nothing but the errors in terms of the program are also highlighted. This user documentation has two main types, one is the end user and the system administrator, as I have already mentioned. In some cases there are some people who are mentioned as target audience must be well understood. So, we may have to understand about who are the end users of the system, that is the target audience, what are their requirements and what is that my product specification in terms of features that are supposed to be provided. So, as far as this product documentation is concerned, there are 5 important areas that should be documented for a formal release of a software application. 1. Functional description of the software, installation instruction, introductory manual, a reference manual and system administrator's guide. So, these manuals are supposed to be in the hands of different community of people, say a people who wanted to be a target audience till the end, a people where the product has to be resolved, say this product for which somebody would have got a franchisee to make corrections to it. This is used to record and track the development process in terms of say planning documentation, cost, schedule, fund tracking, standards, etc. This documentation is created to allow for successful management of a software product, and it has got a relatively very short lifespan, only important to internal development process, except in case where the customer requires a detailed view into this particular data. Some items such as papers that describe design decisions should be extracted and moved into a product documentation category when they become implemented. So, whenever I try to develop a documentation, it need not be in terms of a paper. The initial agreement that we are supposed to carry out may be in terms of a paper, but the later part of the documentation should be maintained in every phase, where it should be maintained in every computer where it is getting developed. Let us talk something about the quality of this particular documentation. Providing a thorough and professional documentation is important for any size product development team. The problem is that many software professionals lack the writing skills to create professional documents. All documents for a given product should have a similar structure. The structure is basically turned out of the standards that different organizations have provided. Say for example, IEEE has got his own set of standards and substandards by where documentation is required. ISO has come out with their own standards for the documentation. So, the IEEE standard for user documentation list such as structure, which is a superset of what most documents need. We basically maintain this as a benchmark, IEEE standards as a benchmark for most of the documentation procedures. So, some of the author's best practices for this IEEE documentation include: it puts a cover page on all the documents. Say, as we maintain the table of contents, and before which, what is this to talk about? Say, if this documentation is to talk about only requirement specification, then the title of the project and its requirement specification need to be detailed. Divide the documents into chapters with sections and subsections. So, those are to be mentioned in form of a table of content. Add an index if there is a lots of reference information. Add a glossary to define ambiguous words. So, in between, if I have tried introducing some ambiguous words, let the end user or the administrator or a technical audience need to understand those ambiguous words. So, there is supposed to be a glossary which need to be maintained. And if suppose we have introduced any abbreviations, any tables, any figures, those are also to be mentioned as part of this documentation, where there should be a detailed note on all the abbreviations, where and all a table exists, those page numbers have to be mentioned, and figures. So, what standard this particular documentation need to adopt? Standards play an important role in the development, maintenance and usefulness of the documentation. Standards can act as a basis for quality documentation, but are not good enough on their own. Usually, the standards define high level content and organization. Basically, there are three different types of documentation standards. One is the process standard, product standard and interchange standards. So, now let us detail one after another in terms of its slides. First, I will start with the process standards. These process standards define the approach that is to be used when creating the documentation. So, it clearly mentions you with what is the objective, what is the aim with which I start the work and how it has to flow through. So, it does not actually define any content of the documentation. So, we will generally prepare a draft, we will check on the draft by using peer reviews and we revise on the draft and those again is getting checked. Let us have a small break here. Welcome back after the break. I was talking to you about the process, product and interchange standards. To look at a detail of this particular process standard, it is always preferred to maintain an initial draft while we are developing the during the phase of software development life cycle. Say a draft which is to maintain on the different standards need to be initially acquired, so that it is efficient when it comes to the revised document. So, as I have already told, draft of a document need to be initially prepared, and if it is mentioned as a document, if it has been clubbed as a document, that requires and it has gone through a peer reviews. So, whatever that I have tried collecting in terms of interviews, in terms of brainstorming sessions, in terms of walkthroughs, in terms of quality checks, in terms of facilitated application specification technique, whatever it might be, everything need to be documented, but this need not be given to the target audience for their use. These are utilized for the next level of design, where the design engineers might understand with what intentions they have produced this kind of a software, so that they will draw the high level design and the detailed design plus the modular design in the appropriate format. So, after preparing this draft, it is given for check, where there will be a peer review committee which will audit on the entire documentation. If it requires revisal, then it gets revised and it is getting updated. With the product standards, it is not so, and it does not take up all that as a process. As a product, it majorly concentrate on the technical specification of this particular product, and it majorly concentrates on the features that this particular product provides plus the goal that this particular product needs to achieve with. Goal of this particular product standards is to evolve at the documentation that got created with reference to a specific structure and the appearance in terms of, say, graphical user interface. Those are contractually or organizationally required as a standard. So, to detail about the product standards, we have documentation identification standard, structure standard, where we give them a detailed list of the codes that the design engineer and the development engineer or the coder actually provided with. Say the comments relating to those codes, if it requires a major component of documentation, say a class with which this particular lines of code is to be adopted with, so those also has to be mentioned as a separate document. Then appropriately to highlight on a particular product, a PPT need to be prepared, a PowerPoint presentation need to be prepared, which will highlight the features, major features of this particular product, and any updates, say versioning. If for example, we might go for different versions of a Microsoft updates, Microsoft releases. You would have come across with Microsoft Windows 95, Windows 2000, NT, Server Edition, XP, 2007, 2009, 2010, 2013 and so. These are different updations. Say there should be a documentation, need not be started from the scratch, but then these documents has to need to provide the list of updates that has been carried out from the previous versions. So that becomes a standard for the document updation standards. And interchangeable standards, where we might have to provide them with a clear picture of what are the standards that maintains the editable information and what is that requires a non-editable format. So that is why I have made an information here. This is usually not a problem with a single organization, but when sharing data between organizations, these problems majorly occur. Say here mentioning at a point, when we share information between one organization and the organization with whom we have signed it up, those changes are to be incorporated. Say version 1 has been sent to the other person and it has been replicated as version 1.1 or version 2, those needs to be acquainted. Some of the other standards which exist are, say as I have already mentioned, IEEE is being the base standard, is as published standards for user documentation, provides a structure and a superset for content areas. Many organizations probably won't create documents that completely match the standard. So as far as writing style is concerned, there are 10 best practices when writing a very good documentation. Author proposes that group edits of important documents should occur in a similar fashion to software walkthroughs. Although we maintain a group of papers or an individual system based documentation, now everything has gone web based. So whenever a software is to be utilized or downloaded directly from the web, there is an ultimate need for a documentation. So we might have to post these documentations online. So now we have to talk something about the online documentation, either internal to the application or it is to be web based. Requires a rethinking procedure to the presentation style, since normal paper documentation approach do not carry over well. Should act as a supplement to paper documentation. The biggest benefit of web documents are that they always provide a current state. So when I am preparing a documentation, certain standards or certain procedures are to be maintained are, these documents covers the entire process of creating and formatting a document for publication. Author recommends using specialized tools for creating and preparing documents. It is often important to have a professional writer or a document publisher evaluate documents before publication to ensure they look good and will carry over to the paper as well. So, as far as storage is concerned, these documents in terms of papers carries a large volume, whereas if it is published online, it is very easy to get maintained. So, the author recommends file system to store the actual documents, database to store references to the files with metadata to allow searching and referencing. Today, it is probably better to use content management system, where CVs or subversions in terms of free and open source software, and it is easy to set up and maintain it. So, as a conclusion, most of the content seem to be referring to the user documentation, where the design and other similar documents were to be overlooked. Summary: this particular session we concentrated more on software documentation, where I started with describing the need for documentation. I have described about the requirements for documentation. Then we looked at two different variants of documentation. One is called product documentation, the other one with process documentation, and the essence of maintaining the standards for the documentation procedure. It should not be as though we start with doing our own set of documentation. It should be of utmost quality. So, it is essential that we maintain certain standards. So, then we provide documentation quality. Then we have documentation structure and the different documentation storage procedures. Some of the questions for this particular session include, this being the basic question, what is the need for software documentation? Mention the different documentation standards that you come across. One of the standard which we have seen is IEEE. Some other standards that you come across. How are the process standards documentation and product documentation differentiated? Thank you.